A broken soldier and a sadistic lawman collide at a desolate crossroads where a dying dog becomes the catalyst for a lethal reckoning. Marcus Cole carries the scars of 100 battles, but as he confronts a man hiding a monster behind a silver star, he realizes that the most dangerous wars are the ones fought for those who cannot speak. The sun hung low over the jagged horizon of Oak Grove, bleeding a deep, sickly crimson across the cracked asphalt of the Lone Star gas station. It was the kind of heat that didn't just sit on the skin but seeped into the marrow heavy, with the scent of stagnant diesel, parched earth, and the metallic tang of old rust. The station itself was a skeletal remain of a better era, its sign hanging by a single groaning bolt that protested with every dry gust of wind. In this forgotten pocket of the world, silence was usually the only resident, but today, the silence was being methodically shattered. Deputy Wade Harkins wiped a bead of greasy sweat from his forehead with the back of a hand that looked like a slab of raw meat. He was a man built of soft edges and hard intentions, his uniform straining against a torso fueled by cheap beer and unearned authority. His eyes, small and clouded with a peculiar brand of local malice, were fixed on the creature huddled at the base of a rusted iron pillar. Rex, a German shepherd who had once been a proud guardian, was now little more than a bag of bones wrapped in matted, dusty fur. For 3 weeks, the dog had been chained there, the heavy iron links eating into his neck, his water bowl, nothing but a dry ceramic husk filled with dead flies. Wade didn't see a living being. He saw a target for the frustrations of a life spent in a dying town. He gripped the barrel of his Remington 870 shotgun, the wooden stock scarred from years of similar lessons. With a grunt of effort, he swung the weapon like a club. The heavy wood connected with the dog's ribs with a sickening, hollow thud. Rex didn't bark. He didn't have the strength left for it. He only let out a thin, broken wheeze, his legs twitching in the dirt as he tried to curl further into himself. Inside the station, behind a counter layered in dust and expired lottery tickets, Martha Chen watched through the grime-streaked window. Her hands, gnarled by age and hard work, gripped the edge of the register so tightly her knuckles were white. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run out there and throw her body over the dying animal. But she knew the rules of Oak Grove. Harkins was the law, the judge, and the executioner in this stretch of no man's land. To interfere was to invite the kind of accidents that left shops burned and people missing. She closed her eyes, but she couldn't shut out the sound of the next strike or the deputy's low, guttural chuckle that followed it. Wade raised the shotgun again, his shadow stretching long and monstrous across the parking lot. This time he aimed for the head, his face contorting into a mask of jagged satisfaction. He wanted to hear the skull crack. He wanted the finality of it. But just as his muscles tensed for the killing blow, a new sound cut through the heavy air. It wasn't the wind or the groan of the sign. It was the low, rhythmic thrum of a heavy-duty engine, a mechanical growl that vibrated in the very soles of his boots. A black Ford F-150 caked in the gray dust of 1,000 miles rolled into the lot. It didn't slow down with the hesitant pace of a tourist. It moved with a predatory precision, stopping exactly 10 feet from Wade's patrol car. The engine cut out, and for a heartbeat the world went deathly still. The dust kicked up by the tires swirled in the crimson light, coating the truck in a ghostly shroud. The driver's side door opened with a slow, deliberate creak. A man stepped out his boots, hitting the gravel with a finality that seemed to echo. He was tall, built of lean muscle and scarred tissue, wearing a faded tactical jacket and jeans that had seen better days. His hair was cropped short, and his face was a landscape of stoic endurance. This was Marcus Cole. His eyes, a piercing icy blue, didn't look at the gas pumps or the station. They locked onto the deputy, and then onto the broken dog bleeding in the dirt. From the passenger side, a second figure emerged. A Belgian Malinois, sleek and powerful with a coat the color of midnight shadows. The dog didn't bark. He didn't lung. He simply stood by Marcus's hip, his ears pinned back, a low vibrating growl beginning deep in his chest, a sound that felt like an earthquake in the making. Shadow, as he was known, sensed the agony of the animal on the chain. He sensed the rot in the man holding the shotgun. Wade lowered his weapon slightly, his brow furrowed in a mix of confusion and rising irritation. He wasn't used to strangers, and he certainly wasn't used to being interrupted. "Who the hell are you?" he barked, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to reclaim his dominance. "We're closed. Move on before I find a reason to lock you up." Marcus didn't answer immediately. He reached back into the truck, pulling out a canteen. He unscrewed the cap with slow, steady fingers, his gaze never leaving Wade's face. The silence stretched, becoming a physical weight between them. Marcus took a step forward, then another. His movement was fluid, the gait of a man who had walked through minefields and come out the other side. "You're hurting the dog," Marcus said. His voice was low, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a river. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a statement of fact that carried the weight of a death sentence. Wade laughed, a jagged, nervous sound. "This mutt, he's mine. I can do whatever I want with him. It's called discipline, city boy. Now get back in your truck and keep driving if you know what's good for you. I'm the deputy sheriff of this county, and my word is the only law you need to worry about." Marcus stopped 5 feet away. He could smell the stale sweat on the deputy, the cheap oil on the shotgun, and the iron scent of Rex's blood. He looked down at the German shepherd. The dog's eyes flickered open for a second, catching Marcus's gaze. In that brief moment, an unspoken communication passed between them, a recognition of shared trauma, of being discarded by the world they had sworn to protect. Shadow's growl intensified, his hackles rising like a row of jagged teeth. The Malinois was a mirror to Marcus's internal state. While the man remained a statue of frozen rage, the dog was the fire ready to consume. Wade felt the shift in the air. He felt the sudden, terrifying realization that he was no longer the apex predator in this parking lot. His fingers tightened on the shotgun, his knuckles turning white. "I'm going to give you one chance," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming something cold and lethal. "Unchain the dog. Walk into that station. And don't come back out until I'm gone." Wade's face flushed a deep, angry purple. He had spent his whole life bullying the weak, and the sudden challenge felt like a slap. "You think that badge on your dog's collar makes you special," he hissed, pointing the shotgun toward Marcus's chest. "I don't care who you are. You step 1 inch closer, and I'll put a hole in you and that black rat of yours." Martha, watching from the window, felt her breath catch in her throat. She saw Marcus's hand twitch, a subtle, practiced movement toward his side. She realized then that this man wasn't a traveler. He was a storm. He was the consequence that Oak Grove had been inviting for decades. The wind picked up, swirling the dust into a miniature cyclone between the two men. The light was almost gone now, leaving only the bruised purple of the sky to illuminate the violence that was about to unfold. Rex let out one final soft whimper, a plea for mercy that acted like a trigger. Marcus didn't flinch at the sight of the shotgun barrel. He didn't look at the weapon at all. He looked into Wade's soul and saw the cowardice hiding behind the uniform. The air crackled with the energy of a lightning strike about to hit. The standoff had reached its breaking point, and in the shadows of Oak Grove, the law of the badge was about to be replaced by the law of the wolf. The hum of the overhead halogen lights at the gas station was a rhythmic, buzzing drone that grated against the silence of the night. It was a flickering, sickly yellow glow that struggled to push back the encroaching darkness of the surrounding woods. Marcus stood as still as a tombstone, his hand inches from his holstered sidearm, while Shadow remained a low, vibrating growl at his heel. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of spilled gasoline, damp earth, and the metallic tang of impending violence. Wade, the deputy who had initiated the confrontation, was trembling, his eyes darting between Marcus and the dark perimeter of the station. The standoff was interrupted by the low, guttural roar of multiple engines approaching from the main road. 4 white cruisers, with the Oak Grove Sheriff's Department insignia, tore into the gravel lot, their tires kicking up a storm of dust and stones. They maneuvered with practiced precision, forming a semicircle around Marcus's beat-up truck, their high-beam headlights cutting through the gloom like searchlights. The blinding glare forced Marcus to squint, but he did not move. He felt the weight of several laser sights dancing across his chest and shoulders as doors creaked open in unison. From the lead vehicle, a man stepped out with a deliberate, slow grace that commanded the space around him. He wasn't wearing a standard tactical vest like the others. Instead, he wore a crisp tan uniform with silver stars on the collar that caught the flickering light. This was Sheriff Raymond Blackwood. His hair was a shock of silver combed back perfectly, and his face was a map of deep lines and hard-earned authority. He didn't draw his weapon. He simply tucked his thumbs into his utility belt and walked toward Marcus, his boots crunching rhythmically on the gravel. The other deputies, nearly half a dozen of them, moved into flanking positions. They were younger, hungrier, and clearly agitated, their hands hovering over their service pistols. Blackwood raised a hand, a silent command that froze them in place. He stopped exactly 6 feet from Marcus, his eyes scanning the scene with the cold detachment of a predator assessing a rival. He looked at the blood on the ground, then at the shivering, broken form of Rex, the abused Malinois, still huddled near the pump. Finally, his gaze settled on Marcus's eyes. "Evening Sun Blackwood," said his voice, a smooth, honeyed baritone that carried a jagged edge of iron. "You've caused quite a stir in my town. Deputy Wade here tells me you're interfering with official business. Now, I'm a reasonable man, and I'd like to believe this is all just a big misunderstanding. A traveler getting a bit too emotional over a stray animal. Is that what this is?" Marcus didn't blink. He felt the heat from the truck's engine behind him and the cold wind biting at his neck. "This dog isn't a stray," Marcus replied, his voice raspy and low. "He's wearing a department collar. Or at least he was before your boy there tried to kick the life out of him. He's a canine. He deserves better than a shallow grave in the woods." Blackwood let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. "A canine Rex is a failed experiment, Mr. Marcus. He was decommissioned for being unstable. He's property of the county, and how we dispose of our property is none of your concern. You're a long way from home, and you're standing on ground that doesn't take kindly to strangers telling us how to sweep our porch." The sheriff took a step closer, his shadow stretching long and thin across the asphalt. He leaned in, lowering his voice so only Marcus could hear. "I know who you are, or at least I know what you are. You've got that look, the look of a man who's seen too much sand and not enough peace. But let me be clear. There are things in this town's secrets buried in these woods that a man like you shouldn't go digging for. That dog you're so worried about, he's more trouble than he's worth. He's a liability." Marcus felt a shift in the air. It wasn't just about the abuse of an animal. He looked down at Rex. The dog was staring at Blackwood, not with fear, but with a strange, haunting intensity. Despite his injuries, Rex's ears twitched at the sound of the sheriff's voice, and his mangled tail gave a weak, involuntary thump against the ground. There was something in the dog's collar, or perhaps something he had seen, that made him a target. Marcus realized then that Blackwood wasn't here to save his deputy's pride. He was here to ensure the dog didn't leave Oak Grove alive. "I'm taking the dog," Marcus said, the finality in his tone echoing like a gunshot. Blackwood's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned into chips of ice. "Is that so? You're going to walk through my men, put a piece of evidence in your truck, and drive away? That sounds like a very dangerous career choice. You see, the cemetery in this town is full of people who thought they could take things that didn't belong to them. It's a quiet place, very peaceful. I could find you a nice plot right next to the woods." Marcus didn't respond with words. Instead, he moved. With a fluid, powerful motion, he knelt and slid his arms beneath Rex's broken body. The dog let out a soft, pained whimper, but didn't struggle. He seemed to recognize the safety in Marcus's grip. Marcus stood back up, the 40-pound dog cradled against his chest like a fallen soldier. He turned his back on the sheriff, a move of supreme confidence or utter madness, and walked toward the open door of his truck. The sound of half a dozen holsters being unsnapped filled the air. The deputies shifted their boots, scuffing the gravel as they prepared to fire. Wade took a step forward, his shotgun leveled at Marcus's head. "Boss, just give the word," Wade hissed, his face contorted with a mixture of fear and malice. Blackwood watched Marcus's retreating, back his hand slowly, raising to signal his men to hold. A strange predatory glint appeared in his eyes. He wasn't going to stop him. Not here. Not under the lights of the gas station, where the old woman Martha was still watching from the window. He had a better plan. He knew the roads out of Oak Grove better than anyone. He knew where the cell service died, and where the ravines were deep enough to hide a truck for 100 years. "Let him go," Blackwood commanded, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The deputies looked at him in shock, but they didn't dare lower their weapons. Marcus gently placed Rex onto the bench seat of the truck, covering him with a tattered wool blanket. Shadow leaped into the back, his eyes never leaving the deputies. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat, the engine roaring to life with a defiant growl. He didn't look back at Blackwood. He shifted into gear and slowly began to pull away the gravel crunching beneath his heavy tires. As the truck moved past the line of cruisers, the deputies parted like a sea of white and blue. Blackwood stood in the center of the lot, the flickering yellow light casting his face in deep skeletal shadows. He pulled a small radio from his belt and keyed the mic. "He's on the move," Blackwood whispered into the device, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Give him 5 miles. Let him get nice and deep into the Blackwood Pass. Then, I want him run off the road. Don't touch the dog. I need what's inside that collar. The man. Do whatever you want with the man. Just make sure he never sees the sun rise over these mountains again." Marcus drove in silence, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror. He saw the gas station lights fade into a tiny amber dot before being swallowed by the darkness of the trees. Beside him, Rex's breathing was shallow and ragged. The dog's head rested on Marcus's thigh, a silent gesture of trust that weighed heavier than any medal Marcus had ever earned. He knew he was being followed. He could feel the presence of other vehicles lurking just beyond the reach of his headlights, moving like ghosts through the thick timber. The road began to twist and climb, the trees closing in like the walls of a prison. Marcus gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wasn't just a man saving a dog anymore. He was a man heading into a war he hadn't asked for in a town that had forgotten the meaning of justice. And as the first drops of rain began to smear across his windshield, he knew the real hunt had only just begun. The rain hammered against the corrugated metal roof of the isolated barn, creating a rhythmic, deafening roar that drowned out the sounds of the surrounding forest. Beneath the rusted exterior lay a sanctuary of sterile white light and the sharp, piercing scent of antiseptic. Marcus pushed through the heavy wooden doors, his boots slick with mud and blood. In his arms, he cradled the broken form of Rex, the German shepherd's breathing coming in shallow, wet rattles that vibrated against Marcus's chest. Shadow followed closely at his heels, his fur matted into dark spikes, his golden eyes scanning every corner of the room for a threat that hadn't yet arrived but felt inevitable. Sarah Mitchell didn't look up from the stainless steel table where she was organizing surgical instruments. Her hands, gloved in blue latex, were steady, though the flickering fluorescent light overhead cast long, twitching shadows across her tired face. She had spent a decade patching up the casualties of this county's hidden wars, from hunting dogs caught in illegal traps to men who couldn't go to a public hospital without answering questions they didn't want to hear. She gestured toward the center of the room with a blood-stained scalpel. "Lay him down, Marcus. Carefully. If his lung has collapsed every second we waste as a nail in his coffin." Marcus lowered Rex onto the cold metal surface. The dog's eyes were rolled back, showing only the whites, and his paws twitched in a fitful, unconscious rhythm. Sarah moved with the practiced efficiency of a combat medic, her fingers flying over the dog's rib cage. She felt the jagged edges of bone beneath the skin and the heat of internal inflammation. Shadow let out a low, mournful whine, stepping forward to rest his heavy head on the edge of the table. He didn't growl or snap. He simply stood there, a silent sentinel, his presence a stabilizing force in the chaotic room. Sarah paused for a moment, looking at the two dogs, then back at Marcus. "You brought a storm with you, didn't you?" The silence that followed was broken only by the hum of an old refrigerator and the distant roll of thunder. Sarah began the grim work of cleaning the wounds, her voice dropping to a low, gravelly whisper as she worked. "This dog didn't just wander off a porch, Marcus. I know this animal. Or rather, I knew his owner. He wasn't a stray. He belonged to Tommy Wells." Marcus froze his hand halfway to the holster at his hip. Tommy Wells, the farmer who disappeared 6 months ago, the one the sheriff claimed had hopped a bus to Vegas and abandoned his land. Sarah let out a bitter, hollow laugh, her eyes never leaving the incision she was making. Tommy wouldn't have left his land for a pot of gold, and he damn sure wouldn't have left Rex. She pulled a jagged piece of metal from Rex's shoulder, a fragment of a specialized high-velocity round used only by the local tactical unit. Tommy found something out near the old mill, Marcus. He came to me a week before he vanished, scared out of his mind. He told me the Blackwood family wasn't just running the town. They were using the mountain passes to move things that shouldn't be moved. He had proof. He was going to the federal authorities. Then his house burned down, and the sheriff's office called it an accidental electrical fire. They never found a body, just a lot of ash and a dog that everyone thought had perished in the flames. Marcus felt a cold chill settle in his marrow. He looked down at Rex, whose chest was now rising and falling with a bit more regularity thanks to the sedative Sarah had administered. This dog is the only witness, Marcus realized aloud. His voice was a low rumble of growing fury. He didn't just survive the fire. He saw who set it. That's why Blackwood wants him dead. That's why they're hunting us like animals. Shadow let out a sharp, resonant bark as if confirming the gravity of the revelation. The black dog moved closer to Rex, licking the smaller dog's ear with a tenderness that seemed almost human. Sarah wiped her brow with the back of her arm, leaving a smear of red across her forehead. She looked at Marcus with a mixture of pity and fear. "You can't stay here. If they find out I'm helping you, they'll burn this place down with me inside it. But you can't leave yet either. The dog needs an hour to stabilize." She turned back to the medicine cabinet, reaching for a bottle of antibiotics. As she moved, she whispered the name again, almost to herself. Poor Tommy. He was a good man. He just didn't realize that in this town, the law and the criminals wear the same uniform. Suddenly, the air in the room seemed to shift. Rex's ears flickered at the mention of the name Tommy. His eyes snapped open, clouded with pain and medication, but filled with a sudden, desperate recognition. The dog struggled to lift his head, his front paws scratching weakly against the stainless steel. A low, guttural sound erupted from his throat, not a growl, but a cry of pure, unadulterated grief. He tried to push himself up, his fractured ribs grinding together, his body shaking, with the effort of a creature trying to find a master who was no longer there. Shadow immediately lunged forward, placing a heavy paw on Rex's shoulder to keep him pinned down, a silent command for his friend to stay still and heal. Marcus reached out his large hand, covering Rex's head, stroking the soft fur behind his ears. "Easy, boy. Easy. We've got you." The dog's frantic movements slowed his breathing, hitching as he looked into Marcus's eyes. In that moment, a bond was forged that transcended the simple relationship of man and beast. They were both survivors of a system that had tried to break them. They were both ghosts in a town that wanted them forgotten. Rex let out one final shaky breath and slumped back onto the table, his eyes closing again, but the tension in his body remained a coiled spring, ready to snap at the first sign of danger. The silence was shattered by the sharp electronic chirp of Marcus's burner phone. The vibration rattled against the wooden counter, sounding like a gunshot in the quiet clinic. Marcus snatched it up, his thumb swiping across the cracked screen. The message was brief, sent from an encrypted, unlisted number. The words burned into his retinas. "Do not trust anyone. They are coming for the clinic. Meet me at the old textile factory at midnight. I have the rest of Tommy's proof." Marcus looked at the clock on the wall. It was 11:15 p.m. The factory was 5 miles away through the densest part of the Blackwood woods. He looked at Sarah, who had gone pale, her hand gripping the edge of the sink. "They know," she whispered, her voice trembling. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. He reached into his bag and pulled out his sidearm, checking the chamber with a metallic click that signaled the end of any hope for a peaceful night. He began to wrap Rex back in the wool blanket, his movements fast and precise. Sarah watched him, her eyes wide with a sudden realization. "You're going, aren't you? You're walking right into their trap." Marcus slung his rifle over his shoulder and hoisted the wrapped dog into his arms. Shadow was already at the door, his teeth bared in a silent snarl directed at the darkness outside. "It might be a trap," Marcus said, his voice as cold as the rain hitting the roof. "But it's the only lead we have, and I'm tired of running. If they want to fight, I'm going to give them one they'll never forget." He kicked open the barn door, the cold wind whipping into the room, scattering medical papers across the floor. The darkness swallowed him and the dogs instantly. The red taillights of his truck, the only spark of color in a world of gray and black. As he pulled away, the headlights cutting through the downpour, he saw a flash of blue and red lights, reflecting off the trees in his rearview mirror. They were coming. The hunt had moved from the shadows into the open, and the midnight meeting at the factory was no longer just a rendezvous. It was a countdown to an execution. The old grain mill stood like a skeletal giant against the bruised purple of the midnight sky. It was a relic of a forgotten era, its wooden bones rotting, and its corrugated iron skin weeping rust into the sodden earth. Marcus pulled his truck into the shadow of a collapsed loading dock, the engine dying with a final shuddering gasp. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was heavy and expectant, filled only by the rhythmic drumming of rain on the metal roof and the low, mournful whistle of the wind as it sliced through the gaps in the walls. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, his ears twitching at sounds Marcus couldn't yet hear, while Rex lay in the back, his breathing shallow but steady. Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, his boots sinking into the thick black mud. He didn't close the door all the way, leaving it slightly ajar for a quick escape if things turned lethal. He reached into the back and checked on Rex, ensuring the bandages were holding, then signaled for Shadow to follow. The Belgian Malinois leaped silently into the mud, his dark coat making him nearly invisible in the gloom. Marcus felt the cold weight of his rifle against his shoulder and the sharp grip of his sidearm at his hip. He moved toward the main entrance, a cavernous opening where the heavy sliding doors had long ago fallen off their tracks. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet dust mold and machine oil. Massive wooden pillars reached upward into a darkness that the moon could not penetrate. Marcus kept his back to the wall, his eyes scanning the cavernous space. Suddenly, a beam of light cut through the dark from the upper mezzanine, swinging down to catch him in its glare. Marcus reacted instantly, dropping to one knee and leveling his rifle at the source. Shadow let out a low, vibrating growl that echoed off the hollow walls. "Don't shoot," a voice called out. It was a woman's voice, steady but strained, carrying an edge of exhaustion that Marcus recognized all too well. It was the sound of someone who had been running for a long time. The light tilted away, illuminating the figure descending the rusted iron stairs. It was Elena Vasquez, the deputy sheriff. She was dressed in her uniform, but it was disheveled, her badge pinned crookedly to a jacket soaked with rain. Her face was pale, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, and her eyes were rimmed with red. She held her hands out away from her body, showing she wasn't reaching for her weapon. Marcus didn't lower his rifle. "You were at the farm," he said, his voice a low rasp. "You were with them." Elena stopped at the bottom of the stairs, her chest heaving. "I had to be, Marcus. If I hadn't been there, Blackwood would have sent someone who wouldn't have missed. I'm the only reason you made it out of that barn alive." She took a tentative step forward, her boots crunching on broken glass. "I've been trying to bring him down from the inside for 2 years. Tommy was my informant. He was the only one brave enough to help me." Marcus slowly stood up, though his finger remained near the trigger. "Why now? Why this place?" Elena pulled a thick, waterproof envelope from inside her jacket and held it out. "Because time just ran out. Blackwood isn't just a corrupt sheriff running a small town. He's the centerpiece of a corridor. He's moving more than just drugs, Marcus. He's moving people, young women, children, untraceable weapons. This mill, it's one of the staging points. Look around you. Those crates over there aren't for grain." She tossed the envelope onto a nearby workbench. Marcus kept his eyes on her as he reached out and flipped it open. Inside were photographs, grainy, long-distance shots of blacked-out SUVs, ledgers with coded names, and maps of interstate routes that bypassed every major checkpoint. But the most damning piece was a series of bank statements linked to offshore accounts, all bearing the signatures of Blackwood and several high-ranking officials in the state capital. "Tommy found the master ledger," Elena whispered, her voice cracking. "He knew where the physical copies were kept. He hid them in a place only he and that dog knew. That's why they're hunting Rex. It's not about what the dog saw. It's about what the dog can lead them to." Tommy trained Rex to find specific scents to guard specific locations. The dog is the map, Marcus, and Blackwood knows that if that ledger goes public, his entire empire collapses, and he takes half the state government down with him. Marcus looked at the documents, then back at the wounded dog waiting in the truck. The gravity of the situation settled over him like a lead shroud. This was no longer just a rescue mission or a fight for survival. This was a war against a machine that had been grinding lives into the dirt for decades. Elena stepped closer, her face hardened by a sudden, fierce resolve. "I tried to go to the FBI," she said, her voice dripping with bitterness. "I sent them a preliminary report 6 months ago. 2 weeks later, my partner was killed in a hit-and-run that was never investigated. There are people in the Bureau who are on Blackwood's payroll. There is no one left to trust." Marcus looked at her, seeing the same hollowed-out look he saw in his own reflection every morning. The system had failed them both. The law was a shield for the monsters, and the light of justice had been snuffed out by greed. He reached out and closed the envelope, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. He thought of Tommy dying alone in the mud. He thought of Rex carrying the burden of a dead man's secret. "So what do we do?" Elena asked, her eyes searching his. "We can't stay here. Blackwood has the whole county locked down." Marcus didn't hesitate. His voice was cold, devoid of the hesitation that had plagued him since he left the service. "We stop running," he said. "They think we're prey. They think they can hunt us down and bury us in these woods." He looked toward the dark entrance of the mill, where the rain was turning into a torrential downpour. "We're going to show them that they picked the wrong man to push. We're going to take that ledger, and then we're going to burn Blackwood's world to the ground." Elena nodded, a grim smile touching her lips. It was a pact signed in the shadows of a dying mill. But the moment of resolve was shattered by a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the roar of the storm. From the distance, the faint, rhythmic wail of sirens began to rise. At first, it was barely audible, but within seconds, the sound grew louder, accompanied by the flickering reflection of red and blue lights bouncing off the low-hanging clouds. "They're here," Elena breathed, reaching for her sidearm. "Blackwood's deputies. He must have had a tracker on my car." Marcus didn't panic. He moved with a calculated, lethal grace. "Get to the truck," he commanded. "Take Shadow and Rex. There's a back trail through the marsh that leads to the old logging road. It's too soft for their cruisers, but your 4x4 and my truck can make it." Elena looked at him confused. "What about you, Marcus?" Picked up his rifle, the metal, cold and familiar in his hands. "I'll give them something else to focus on," he said. "I'll meet you at the bridge in 20 minutes. If I'm not there, keep going. Don't stop until you reach the state line." He didn't wait for her to argue. He vanished into the labyrinth of rusted machinery and wooden crates, becoming a ghost in the machine. As the first police cruiser roared into the mill's gravel lot, its searchlight cutting a white gash through the darkness, Marcus took his position. The hunt was over. The counterattack had begun. Marcus climbed out of the cab, his boots sinking into the saturated soil with a wet, sucking sound. His body ached with a fatigue that went deeper than bone, a residue of the firefight at the mill, and the relentless pursuit that had followed them across the county lines. He walked around to the passenger side and opened the door. Rex was there, his breathing shallow but steady. The dog's flank was bandaged with a ragged piece of Marcus's own shirt, a dark spreading stain of blood still visible against the white fabric. Despite the pain and the exhaustion, the animal's eyes were bright, filled with a primal intelligence that seemed to understand the gravity of their return to this hollowed-out sanctuary. "Come on, boy," Marcus whispered, his voice a low rasp that barely carried in the damp air. "Show me where he hit it. Show me why he died." Rex hopped down his front paws, hitting the mud with a soft thud. He winced, his back leg dragging slightly, but he didn't whine. He stood still for a moment, his nose twitching, catching the scents of the past, the metallic tang of old farm equipment, the sweet rot of unharvested grain, and the lingering ghostly scent of the man who had raised him from a pup. With a determined huff, the dog began to move, leading Marcus away from the farmhouse and toward the edge of the property, where the land began to slope toward the creek. They walked through the rows of dead corn, the brittle stalks brushing against Marcus's jacket like the skeletal fingers of the dead reaching out to pull him into the earth. The fog was so thick here that the world seemed to dissolve into a gray void just a few yards ahead, making the familiar landscape feel alien and hostile. Rex moved with a singular, unwavering purpose, his head low to the ground. He wasn't tracking a scent from today. He was following a memory burned into his very soul, a secret shared between a man and his dog in the dead of night. They reached a massive, ancient oak tree that stood alone on a small rise, its twisted, leafless branches clawing at the leaden sky like the hands of a condemned man. This tree had seen generations of the Wells family come and go, a silent witness to their triumphs, their labors, and their ultimate ruin. Rex stopped at the base of the tree, positioned between two gnarled roots that looked like the knuckles of a buried giant. He began to scrape at the earth with his front paws, his movements frantic and desperate despite his injury. Marcus knelt beside him, placing a steadying hand on the dog's shoulder to calm him. "I've got it, Rex. Move back. I'll take it from here." Marcus pulled a folding and trenching tool from his pack, the metal cold and biting in his hands, and began to dig. The soil was cold and packed tight, resisting the blade of the shovel, as if the earth itself was trying to keep its secrets buried. Marcus worked in a rhythmic, desperate silence, the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, despite the morning chill. The only sounds were the rasp of the shovel and Rex's heavy, rhythmic panting. After several minutes of grueling labor, the shovel struck something hard, with a dull metallic clank that vibrated up Marcus's arms. He dropped the tool and fell to his knees, clearing the remaining dirt with his bare hands, his fingernails caking with black, frozen mud. He unearthed a heavy, rusted metal ammunition box, the lid sealed tight with layers of weathered duct tape that had turned gray and brittle over time. He hauled it out of the hole, the weight of it promising something more than just paper. It felt like the weight of a man's life. Marcus sat back on his heels, the box resting on his thighs, and looked at Rex. The dog was watching him intently, his ears pricked forward, his tail giving a single slow wag that spoke of a mission finally accomplished. This was the end of the trail Tommy Wells had laid out, a path through the darkness that led back to the light. With a quick, violent flick of his knife, Marcus sliced through the layers of tape and pried the lid open. The hinge groaned in protest, a sharp metallic screech that seemed to echo across the empty fields like a scream. Inside, protected from the elements by thick plastic bags, was the legacy of Tommy Wells. There were stacks of photographs Tommy and his wife Sarah on their wedding day, laughing in front of this very farmhouse. Tommy holding a newborn son, with a look of terrifyingly pure love. Tommy and Rex playing in the creek. Beneath the photos lay a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with neat, cramped handwriting, dates, names of high-ranking officials, and the specific amounts of bribes paid by Blackwood's associates to turn a blind eye to the poison being pumped into the county's veins. But it was the small handheld tape recorder at the bottom of the box that drew Marcus's attention. He picked it up, feeling the cold, cheap plastic in his palm. He checked the batteries, finding them corroded and dead, but he had spares in his tactical kit. He swapped them out with trembling fingers, the gravity of the moment pressing down on his chest until it was hard to breathe. He pressed the play button. A hiss of heavy static filled the air, followed by the sound of a heavy, labored sigh and the rustle of paper. Then a voice emerged from the small speaker, a voice that was weary, broken, but undeniably clear. It was the voice of a man who knew he was already dead. "If you're hearing this, it means I didn't make it back," the voice said. It was Tommy Wells. He sounded much older than he looked in the photographs, the weight of his secrets having aged him prematurely. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. I thought I could change things from the inside. I thought if I just played along for a little while, I could gather enough to bring them all down and keep us safe. But Blackwood, he's a virus, Sarah. He's in everything. He's in the water, the soil, the law. There's no corner of this county he hasn't touched with his rot." The voice paused, and in the background of the recording, the sound of a distant dog barking could be heard. Marcus looked at Rex. The dog's ears were pinned back, his head tilted as he listened to the ghost of his master speaking from beyond the veil. Tommy's voice continued shaking with an emotion that was raw and unfiltered. "I've put everything in this box. The ledger, the bank transfers, the proof of the toxic dumping at the old mill that's been killing the livestock. It's all here. Use it. Don't let them win. And Rex, tell the boy he was the best partner I ever had. God help me. I just wanted to go home." The tape ended with a sharp, final click, leaving a silence that was even more profound and painful than before. The weight of Tommy's sacrifice settled into Marcus's chest like a physical blow, a cold stone of grief and rage. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for his own survival. or for a piece of evidence. He was fighting for the soul of a man who had died trying to do the right thing, in a world that had forgotten what that meant. He looked at the photos again, seeing the hope in Tommy's eyes, a hope that had been extinguished by the very people Marcus was now hunting. Rex suddenly stood up, his gaze fixed on the gray shifting horizon. He let out a sound that Marcus would never forget, a long, mournful howl that tore through the morning fog like a jagged blade. It wasn't a cry of pain or a warning. It was a dirge, a final heartbreaking salute to the man who had loved him, a cry of loyalty that transcended the boundary between life and death. The sound echoed off the farmhouse and the distant, unseen hills, a lonely, haunting vibration that seemed to make the very air tremble. In that moment, the bond between the dog and the dead man was palpable, a thread of steel that even Blackwood's bullets couldn't break. As the echo of Rex's howl died away, the silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer expectant. It was sharp, jagged, and dangerous. Marcus felt a sudden cold prickle at the base of his neck, the honed instinct of a soldier who had spent too much of his life in the crosshairs. He didn't move his head, but his eyes darted down to his own chest. There, centered perfectly over his heart, was a tiny, brilliant dot of crimson light, a laser sight steady and lethal. The red dot danced slightly with the rhythm of a distant shooter's breath, a silent promise of the violence to come. Marcus didn't panic. Panic was for the unprepared. He slowly, deliberately closed the lid of the metal box, his mind already calculating the distance to the nearest cover and the angle of the shot. The shadows at the edge of the cornfield shifted, and the faint metallic click of a rifle bolt being cycled whispered through the damp air. Blackwood's cleaners hadn't just followed them. They had been waiting, circling the farm like wolves around a dying fire. Marcus looked at Rex, who had stopped howling and was now baring his teeth, a low guttural growl vibrating in his chest. The dog sensed the threat, his hackles raised, his predatory instincts overriding his grief. The time for mourning was over. The hunt had returned to their doorstep, and this time there would be no running, no hiding in the shadows. Marcus gripped the handle of the metal box and reached for the suppressed rifle leaning against the ancient oak. The first shot rang out a sharp, whip-like crack that shattered the morning peace. The bullet thudded into the wood of the oak just inches above Marcus's head, sending a spray of bark into the air. The war for the Wells farm had begun, and the soil was about to be fed with more than just secrets. The skeletal remains of the Blackwood fire station stood as a jagged tombstone against the encroaching emerald tide of the forest. Once a beacon of safety, it was now a hollowed-out shell of red brick and rusted corrugated iron, its massive bay doors hanging off their hinges like broken jaws. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wet ash motor oil and the sharp metallic tang of fear. Outside, the sky had bruised into a deep, sickly violet before finally rupturing. The rain didn't just fall. It descended in a relentless vertical deluge that turned the surrounding earth into a gluttonous mire of black mud. Marcus moved through the shadows of the engine bay with the silent, predatory grace of a man who had spent more of his life in the dark than the light. He was a phantom in tactical nylon, his movements economical and devoid of wasted energy. He checked the tension on a thin tripwire he had rigged across the rear entrance, connected to a pressurized canister of industrial solvent and a flare. It wasn't meant to kill, not yet. It was meant to disorient, to turn the hunter into the prey. Sarah sat huddled in the corner of the upstairs loft, her hands trembling as she clutched a heavy wrench, the only weapon Marcus would allow her. Beside her, Elena was hunched over a portable radio unit, her fingers flying across the dials with frantic precision. The blue light from the small screen cast ghostly highlights on her sweat-slicked forehead. She was digging through encrypted layers of the federal frequency, a desperate SOS sent into a void that seemed to be swallowed by the storm. The silence of the station was suddenly punctured by the rhythmic, heavy thud of boots on the saturated ground outside. It was a disciplined sound, the cadence of professional killers. Marcus felt the vibration through the soles of his boots. He pressed his back against a soot-stained pillar, his breath slow and shallow. He looked toward the corner where Shadow, the massive Belgian Malinois, crouched. The dog's ears were pinned back, his lips pulled away from his teeth in a silent snarl, his yellow eyes fixed on the darkness of the main bay. A flash of lightning illuminated the world for a fraction of a second, revealing 3 silhouettes framed in the doorway. They moved in a staggered tactical formation, their suppressed carbines sweeping the room with the clinical indifference of machines. Harkins was not among them. He was the shepherd watching from the safety of the perimeter, while his wolves did the bloody work. The lead mercenary stepped forward, his heavy boot coming down directly onto the hidden pressure plate Marcus had buried beneath a layer of discarded rags. A deafening hiss erupted as the canister exploded, venting a cloud of blinding white vapor. The mercenaries recoiled, their night vision goggles suddenly useless in the chemical fog. Marcus didn't wait. He lunged from the shadows, his combat knife a silver blur in the dim light. He caught the first man under the chin, the blade sliding home with a sickeningly soft resistance. Before the body could hit the floor, Marcus had snatched the man's sidearm, pivoting, and firing 2 suppressed rounds into the chest of the second soldier. The third mercenary managed to fire a wild burst, the bullets chewing into the wooden rafters above Sarah's head. Wood splinters rained down like lethal confetti. Sarah let out a stifled scream, which was immediately drowned out by a thunderclap that shook the very foundations of the building. Marcus dived behind the rusted carcass of an old fire engine. The metal groaning as a hail of return fire from outside began to shred the station's thin walls. Harkins's voice boomed over a megaphone, cutting through the roar of the rain with chilling clarity. He told Marcus that there was no need for more blood, that the girl and the data were all that mattered. But the lie was as thin as the air. Marcus knew the protocol of Blackwood's cleaners. They left no witnesses, no survivors, and no evidence. He checked his magazine. He was down to 5 rounds. He looked at Elena, who gave a sharp, frantic nod. The signal had been sent, but help was a lifetime away. The assault intensified. Harkins was no longer playing games. A flashbang grenade arched through a broken window, exploding in a blinding white sun that turned the interior of the station into a nightmare of overexposed shadows. Marcus felt the world tilt, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that threatened to shatter his skull. Through the haze, he saw a shadow moving toward the stairs, a mercenary aiming for Sarah and Elena. Shadow the dog didn't wait for a command. He was a streak of black fur and fury launching himself from the darkness. He hit the mercenary with the force of a high-speed collision, his jaws locking onto the man's throat. The soldier's scream was cut short as they tumbled back into the rain-drenched mud outside. The dog was a whirlwind of primal instinct, protecting the only pack he had left. Marcus forced himself to his feet, his vision swimming. He stumbled toward the side exit, his lungs burning. He saw Harkins standing in the middle of the yard, his coat flapping in the wind, a heavy-caliber pistol raised toward the struggling mass of the dog and the fallen mercenary. Harkins didn't care about his own man. He just wanted the animal dead. Marcus didn't think. He threw himself through the doorway, tackling Harkins just as the villain pulled the trigger. The shot went wide, whistling into the trees. The 2 men slammed into the earth, sliding through the thick, viscous mud. It was a primal struggle stripped of technology and tactics. It was bone against bone, fist against face. Harkins was strong, fueled by a sadistic arrogance, his fingers clawing at Marcus's eyes. They rolled through the muck, their clothing becoming indistinguishable from the black earth. Marcus felt a rib crack under a heavy blow from Harkins' knee, but he didn't let go. He grabbed a handful of the villain's hair and slammed his head into the base of a rusted fuel pump. Harkins roared, a sound of pure animal rage, and managed to wrap his hands around Marcus's throat, squeezing with the strength of a man possessed. The world began to dim at the edges for Marcus. The sound of the rain faded into a dull hum. He could see Harkins' teeth bared in a grotesque grin of triumph. But then the dog was there. Shadow, bloodied but unbowed, lunged at Harkins' arm, his teeth sinking deep into the forearm that held Marcus's life in the balance. Harkins screamed, his grip loosening just enough for Marcus to drive a jagged piece of broken glass he'd palmed from the mud into the villain's shoulder. As they struggled in the filth, a new sound began to drown out the storm. It wasn't the rhythmic beating of the rain or the thunder of the clouds. It was the rhythmic, mechanical throb of heavy rotors. Searchlights powerful enough to cut through the deluge swept across the forest floor like the eyes of God. The trees bowed under the downdraft of approaching Black Hawk helicopters. The light caught the insignia on the side of the lead aircraft FBI. Elena's gamble had paid off. The cavalry hadn't just arrived. They had come with the wrath of the federal government. Loudspeakers barked orders to drop weapons, and the forest was suddenly flooded with the harsh, artificial glow of a dozen tactical spotlights. Harkins looked up the light, reflecting in his wide, panicked eyes. He realized in that moment that the shadows he had operated in for so long had finally been burned away. He looked back at Marcus, a final desperate snarl on his lips, but Marcus was already pulling Sarah and Elena toward the safety of the perimeter. The long night at the fire station was ending, but the echoes of the battle would linger in the mud, and the blood long after the rain stopped falling. The Blackwood estate sat like a jagged crown upon the ridge of the Blackwood Valley, a sprawling monument of cold limestone and reinforced glass that seemed to bleed out of the very rock it was built upon. The surrounding forest was a tangled web of ancient pines and suffocating mist, a natural barrier that the master of the house had reinforced with high-tension fences and infrared sensors. Tonight, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and the electric hum of a fortress on high alert. Somewhere deep within those walls, the architects of 1,000 tragedies were gathering to celebrate their latest conquest, unaware that the ghost of their past was already at the gates. Marcus stood at the edge of the perimeter, his silhouette swallowed by the velvet shadows of a towering oak. Beside him, Shadow was a statue of coiled muscle, his dark fur damp with the lingering mountain dew, his amber eyes fixed on the sweeping arc of a distant searchlight. Marcus checked the digital display on his wrist, a device Tommy had rigged weeks before his death. The map was a skeletal web of lines and red dots, showing the hidden veins of the estate, the service tunnels and drainage pipes that the architects had forgotten but Tommy had meticulously mapped. The entrance to the tunnel was a rusted iron grate, hidden beneath a layer of rotting leaves and heavy river stones. Marcus worked in silence, his fingers moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had spent his life in the dark. With a low groan of protesting metal, the grate gave way, revealing a yawning black maw that smelled of stagnant water and old copper. He signaled to Shadow, and the dog slipped into the hole without a sound, a phantom returning to the earth. Marcus followed the cold dampness of the tunnel walls, pressing in on him like the weight of a heavy secret. They moved through the subterranean dark for what felt like miles. The tunnel was narrow, forcing Marcus to crouch his tactical boots, splashing softly in the shallow, oily water that lined the floor. Tommy's notes were precise, marking every junction and every pressure sensor. Every few hundred yards, Marcus had to stop using a handheld frequency jammer to blind the internal cameras that guarded the intersections. The tension was a physical thing, a tightening in his chest that only eased when he felt the rhythmic throb of the mansion's industrial HVAC system ahead. The tunnel ended at a heavy steel hatch that led directly into the mansion's sub-basement. Marcus pressed his ear to the cold metal, hearing nothing but the distant rhythmic hum of machinery. He cracked the seal, and the smell changed instantly from the rot of the earth to the sterile, expensive scent of filtered air and floor wax. They emerged into a labyrinth of pipes and server racks, the heart of the estate's digital nervous system. This was the belly of the beast, where the data of 100 illegal lives was stored in humming silicon. Above them, the mansion was alive. Through the vents, Marcus could hear the muffled sounds of laughter and the clinking of crystal. It was a banquet of vultures. He climbed a service ladder, Shadow waiting patiently at the base, his ears twitching at every vibration. Marcus reached a maintenance crawl space that overlooked the grand hall. Through the narrow slats of the ventilation cover, he saw them men in $5,000 suits, high-ranking officials whose faces graced the evening news, and at the head of the table, Silas Blackwood himself. Blackwood looked every bit the king of this dark hill. His silver hair was slicked back, and his eyes cold as Arctic ice scanned the room with a predator's satisfaction. He raised a glass of amber liquid, the light from the chandelier dancing in the crystal. He was speaking of progress and necessary sacrifices, his voice a smooth, cultured purr that masked the rot of his soul. Marcus felt a surge of white-hot fury, but he forced it down. He wasn't here to be a butcher. He was here to be the light that burned the shadows away. Marcus moved back to the server hub, his fingers flying across a keyboard he had patched into the main interface. He bypassed the firewalls with the codes Tommy had died to protect. The system resisted for a moment, a digital gatekeeper demanding a price, and then it broke. On every screen in the mansion, from the security monitors to the giant displays in the ballroom, a file began to upload. Marcus reached for the master volume control, his hand trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the gravity of the moment. Suddenly, the music in the grand hall died. The laughter faltered, replaced by a confused murmur. Then a voice filled the house, not the smooth, practiced tones of a politician, but the raw, terrified yet resolute voice of a young man who knew his time was up. It was Tommy. The recording began with the sound of his heavy breathing, the clatter of a keyboard, and then his words, clear and haunting, detailing every transaction, every bribe, and every life sold into the darkness by the men sitting in that room. The effect was instantaneous. In the grand hall, the officials froze their faces, turning the color of ash. Blackwood's glass shattered on the floor, the amber liquid spilling like a bloodstain across the white marble. The recording didn't just play in the room. Marcus had routed it through the estate's external PA system, broadcasting Tommy's confession into the forest, to the guards at the gate, and to the tactical teams he knew were closing in. The secrets that had built this empire were being stripped bare, one syllable at a time. Panic erupted. Men scrambled for their phones only to find the signal jammed. Guards rushed the doors, but the electronic locks had been cycled into a lockdown loop by Marcus's virus. They were trapped in a cage of their own making. Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the basement stairs. Shadow at his side, the dog's low growl vibrating in the air. He didn't carry his rifle. He carried only a small handheld recorder, the physical manifestation of the truth that was currently tearing the room apart. Marcus walked into the grand hall, just as the recording reached its climax, Tommy naming Blackwood as the man who had pulled the trigger. The silence that followed was heavier than any sound. The vultures at the table looked at Marcus as if he were a vengeful spirit. Blackwood stood alone at the head of the table, his composure finally breaking, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. He looked at the cameras, then at the men he had bought, and finally at Marcus. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, a growing chorus of justice rising from the valley floor. Blue and red lights began to flicker through the high windows, dancing across the terrified faces of the elite. The perimeter had been breached. The FBI teams Elena had coordinated were swarming the grounds, their flashlights cutting through the fog like blades. The fortress was falling not by fire but by the weight of its own sins. Blackwood didn't flee. He didn't beg. Instead, he reached into the small of his back, his hand emerging with a gold-plated revolver. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown with a desperate, suicidal light. He knew the world outside those walls was gone for him. He knew the name Blackwood would now be synonymous with filth. He leveled the gun at Marcus's chest, his finger tightening on the trigger, a man determined to take the truth to the grave with him. Blackwood stood at the head of the long mahogany table, his face a contorted landscape of disbelief and primal rage. The men around him, the so-called vultures who had feasted on his crumbs, were no longer allies. They were cornered animals looking for any exit that didn't lead to a federal prison. When the first flashbang detonated against the reinforced glass of the south wing, the sound was like the world cracking open. White light flooded the room, turning the opulent decor into a washed-out nightmare. In that moment of blinding chaos, Blackwood didn't reach for his dignity or his lawyers. He reached for his survival. With a desperate lunging movement, Blackwood threw himself toward the heavy oak paneling behind his desk. His fingers trembling with a palsy of pure terror, clawed at a hidden indentation in the wood. With a groan of heavy machinery, a section of the wall receded, revealing the dark, yawning mouth of a service tunnel, a relic of the Cold War era designed for a different kind of escape. He vanished into the shadows, just as the heavy boots of the FBI tactical teams thundered into the room, their voice commands lost in the roar of the wind whipping through the broken windows. Rex felt the vibration of the secret door closing before he saw it. The German shepherd's senses were heightened to a razor's edge, fueled by an adrenaline that masked the agonizing throb in his wounded shoulder. He didn't need a command from Marcus. He didn't need a scent trail. He knew the smell of his tormentor better than he knew the scent of the pine needles in the forest. It was a smell of expensive cologne mixed with the sour, oily sweat of a coward. Rex let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to shake his very bones. Beside him, Shadow was a black blur of focused intensity, his eyes fixed on the point where the wall had swallowed the man. The two dogs surged forward as one. They bypassed the tactical teams, slipping through the legs of the armored officers with the fluid grace of predators. Marcus yelled for them, his voice a mix of pride and desperate concern, but the dogs were already gone. They hit the secret door just as it was clicking shut, Shadow's powerful snout wedging into the closing gap. With a collective heave of muscle and will, the two dogs forced their way into the darkness. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare of damp concrete and low-hanging pipes. The only sound was the frantic, uneven slapping of Blackwood's leather shoes against the shallow water on the floor. He was running blindly, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. Behind him, the sound of the dogs was a rhythmic, terrifying promise. The click-clack of their claws on the concrete echoed off the walls, multiplying until it sounded like 100 hounds were descending upon him. Every time Blackwood looked back, he saw nothing but the twin pairs of glowing eyes, gold and emerald, cutting through the gloom like spectral fires. Rex pushed through the pain each step, a testament to his resilience. The tunnel sloped downward, leading toward the natural limestone caverns that sat beneath the estate. The air grew colder, smelling of ancient earth and stagnant water. He could hear Blackwood stumbling the man's curses, becoming more incoherent as the darkness pressed in. Rex didn't want to just catch him. He wanted the man to feel the weight of every fear he had ever inflicted on a living soul. The dog's breath was a steady, hot steam in the frigid air, a rhythmic engine of retribution that would not be denied. They burst out of a concealed exit near the base of the cliffside, the sudden vastness of the night air hitting them like a physical blow. The forest was thick with a spectral fog that clung to the trees like wet wool. Blackwood was a shambling silhouette, tripping over exposed roots and mossy rocks as he scrambled toward the edge of a rushing mountain stream. The water was high, swollen by recent rains, a churning ribbon of white foam in the moonlight. He reached the bank and turned his back to the water, his chest heaving so hard it seemed his ribs might snap. Rex and Shadow emerged from the trees, slow and deliberate. They didn't bark, they didn't lunge. They simply fanned out, cutting off the only landward escape routes. Rex stepped into a patch of moonlight, his fur matted with mud, the white bandage on his shoulder stained with a fresh bloom of red. He stood tall, his head held high, looking down at the man who had once held his leash with such cruelty. The silence between them was absolute, save for the roar of the river and the distant fading wail of sirens from the mansion above. Blackwood reached into the small of his back, his hand emerging with a gold-plated revolver. He leveled it at Rex, his arm shaking so violently the barrel danced in the air. "Get back," he screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I'll kill you. I'll bury you in the mud where you belong." Rex didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. He looked directly into the black hole of the barrel, with a chilling primordial disdain. He had faced fire, steel, and betrayal. A piece of metal in the hand of a broken man was nothing. Shadow moved slightly to the left, a low, guttural warning, vibrating in his throat, drawing Blackwood's frantic attention away from Rex. It was a tactical maneuver, a silent communication between brothers. Blackwood swung the gun toward Shadow, but his footing was treacherous. His heel caught on a slick stone and he tipped backward. For a second, he hovered on the edge of the bank, his arms windmilling the gold-plated gun flying from his grip and disappearing into the churning white water with a pathetic splash. He fell hard into the shallows, the icy water soaking into his expensive wool suit. He tried to scramble up, but Rex was there. The dog didn't bite. He didn't tear. He simply placed a single heavy paw on Blackwood's chest, pinning him into the freezing mud. Rex leaned down his face, inches from Blackwood's. He let out a single sharp exhale, a breath that carried the scent of the forest and the freedom Blackwood had tried to steal. It wasn't an attack. It was an act of supreme contempt. Rex looked at him not as a master, but as a pathetic small creature that had finally been outgrown. The woods suddenly flooded with light as the FBI tactical teams led by Marcus and Elena broke through the tree line. High-intensity beams cut through the fog, illuminating the scene in a harsh, unforgiving glare. Marcus ran to the bank, his heart in his throat, stopping only when he saw the three of them. He saw his dogs, his boys standing guard over the fallen tyrant. He saw the strength in Rex's stance, and the unwavering loyalty in Shadow's eyes. The agents moved in their boots, splashing in the water as they hauled Blackwood to his feet. One of the officers reached down and picked up a heavy gold-plated badge that had fallen from Blackwood's pocket during the struggle. It was the symbol of his authority, the shield he had used to hide his monstrous nature. The officer looked at it for a moment with disgust, then dropped it into the black, sucking mud of the riverbank. He ground it under his heel as he marched the former king of Oak Grove toward the waiting handcuffs. As the sun began to bleed over the eastern ridges, turning the gray fog into a veil of shimmering gold, the chaos began to subside. The helicopters drifted away, their mission complete. The mansion on the hill sat dark and silent, no longer a throne but a crime scene. Marcus sat on a fallen log by the stream, his arms around both Rex and Shadow. He buried his face in Rex's neck, feeling the steady, rhythmic thrum of the dog's life force. The first rays of the morning light hit the water, making the stream sparkle like a ribbon of diamonds. Rex leaned his head against Marcus's chest, his eyes closing as the exhaustion finally took hold. But even in his tiredness, there was a peace he hadn't known in a lifetime. The debt was paid, the ghosts were gone. In the quiet of the dawn, the three of them stood as a testament to a bond that no amount of gold or power could ever break. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of the countryside, like a soft white shroud slowly retreating as the sun began to crest the horizon. This was no longer the jagged, suffocating terrain of Oak Grove. Here the air tasted of cedar and wild clover, carrying the distant rhythmic sound of paws hitting the earth. 6 months had passed since the night the river ran black with the secrets of a fallen empire. On the gate of the sprawling estate, a hand-carved wooden sign swung gently in the breeze, bearing the name Guardian Watch. It was more than a sanctuary for retired service animals. It was a fortress of redemption. Marcus stood on the wide porch of the farmhouse, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. The steam rose in thin, swirling ribbons, momentarily obscuring the scars on his knuckles. He watched as the golden light touched the training grounds below, where obstacle courses and agility tunnels were laid out with surgical precision. He wasn't the same man who had crawled through the mud half a year ago. His movements were slower, more deliberate, and the haunted sharpness in his eyes had softened into a quiet, watchful vigilance. Beside him, Shadow sat like a statue carved from obsidian. The older dog's muzzle was grayer now, but his ears remained pricked, scanning the perimeter with the instinct of a veteran. Below them, in the tall grass, Rex was in full motion. The German shepherd moved with a fluid, terrifying grace, leading a group of 3 younger rescues through a series of tactical drills. There was no aggression in Rex's posture, only a focused, commanding authority. He was no longer a weapon of terror. He was a teacher. The memory of the Supreme Court hearing still played in Marcus's mind like a grainy film reel. He remembered the cold, sterile air of the courtroom, and the way his voice had echoed against the marble walls as he spoke the truth that Oak Grove had tried to bury for decades. He had looked directly at Blackwood, who sat stripped of his finery, looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. Marcus had laid out the evidence, the ledgers, the recordings, and the physical scars on the animals. It was the day the system finally worked, not because of power, but because of the unwavering loyalty of those who couldn't speak for themselves. Oak Grove was breathing again. With the corruption excised like a tumor, the town had begun a slow, painful recovery. The boarded-up shops on Main Street were being repainted, and children played in the parks that had once been the hunting grounds for Blackwood's goons. Elena had stayed behind to oversee the restructuring of the local government, sending Marcus weekly updates. The fear that had once defined the town had been replaced by a cautious, burgeoning hope. Marcus set his coffee down and whistled a low, sharp note that carried across the fields. Immediately, Rex halted his play and looked up his tail, giving a single, powerful wag before he began a steady trot toward the house. The younger dogs followed his lead, settling into a disciplined formation. Marcus felt a swell of pride in his chest. They were building something here that mattered. They were taking the broken and making them whole. A cloud of dust appeared at the end of the long driveway, signaling the arrival of a vehicle. Rex let out a low, inquisitive woof, but stayed in his seated position. A silver SUV pulled up to the gate, and Marcus recognized the driver immediately. It was Lisa Wells, Tommy's widow. She stepped out of the car, looking smaller than Marcus, remembered her face pale, but her eyes filled with a resolve that hadn't been there during their first meeting. She walked toward them slowly, her gaze fixed on Rex. The dog stood up, his body tense but not threatening. As Lisa reached the porch steps, she stopped, her breath hitching in her throat. Rex took a step forward, his nose twitching as he caught her scent, the scent of the man he had once been forced to hunt, and the man Marcus had died a little inside to avenge. Rex let out a soft mourning whine and lowered his head, nudging his wet nose into Lisa's open palm. Lisa collapsed onto her knees, burying her face in the thick fur of Rex's neck. She sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking as she whispered Tommy's name. Rex stood perfectly still, acting as a pillar for her grief, his tail thumping softly against the wooden floorboards. Marcus turned away to give her a moment of privacy, looking out at the horizon. This was the final piece of the debt, the closure that Tommy deserved, and the forgiveness that Rex needed. After a long while, Lisa stood up, wiping her eyes. She looked at Marcus and offered a small, trembling smile. She didn't need to say anything. The look in her eyes told him everything. She had seen the monster in the woods, but now she saw the guardian. Before she left, she handed Marcus a small envelope, a donation to the center, and a letter from the families Rex had helped save during his time in the shadows. Once the SUV had disappeared back down the driveway, Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. He knelt down in front of Rex, who looked at him with soulful, intelligent eyes. Shadow approached, nudging Marcus's shoulder as if to give his approval. Marcus opened the box to reveal a new collar made of thick, high-quality leather with a heavy brass plate. He unclipped the old frayed collar, the last vestige of Rex's life as a captive, and let it fall to the ground. He buckled the new one around the dog's neck. The brass plate caught the sun gleaming brightly. It didn't have a serial number or a tracking code. It simply said, Guardian. Rex shook himself, the new metal jingling musically, and he stood taller, as if he understood the weight of the title he had earned. The peace of the afternoon was suddenly broken by the sharp, insistent vibration of the phone in Marcus's pocket. He pulled it out, his brow furrowing as he read the encrypted message. It was from an anonymous source in a neighboring state, reports of a private security firm using illegally trained canines to terrorize a small mining community. There were photos of injured animals and terrified families. Marcus looked at the screen, then looked at his dogs. The scars on his body ached for a moment, a reminder of the cost of intervention. He could stay here. He could live a quiet life, training dogs, and watching the sun set over his peaceful hills. He had done his part. He had taken down a king. But as he looked into Rex's eyes, he saw the same fire that had burned in the darkness of the Oak Grove woods. The mission wasn't over. It would never be over as long as there were those who used strength to crush the weak. Marcus didn't hesitate. He headed toward the garage, grabbing a heavy tactical bag and tossing it into the back of his black pickup truck. Shadow jumped into the passenger seat with the agility of a dog half his age. Rex leaped into the bed of the truck, his paws clicking against the metal as he stood behind the cab, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Marcus climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The roar of the V8 broke the silence of the farm, a declaration of intent. He looked in the rearview mirror, seeing the Guardian watch sign fade into the distance. He didn't know where this new path would lead, or how many more monsters were waiting in the shadows of the next town. But he knew he wasn't going alone. He had the best of men and the best of dogs by his side. The truck kicked up a cloud of red dust as it sped down the gravel road, heading toward the interstate. The sun was setting behind them, casting long, dramatic shadows across the landscape. The three of them moved as one, a silent promise of justice hurtling toward the next injustice. The war in Oak Grove was won, but the journey of the Guardian had only just begun.